Hello everyone, I'm Spencer Campbell of Gila RPGs, and this video is going to be sort of a rundown of the core rules of Thorn Seedling Edition. This video is going to act as both sort of a how does this game work, how does it play, what are the rules, and also a little bit of a development kind of dive into why the game works the way that it does. So it's not going to be a quick, snappy, here's the rules in 2 minutes, and it's not going to be a super long, here's all the design philosophy in the game. It's going to be sort of a mix of the two. This is the first video that I'll be doing for Thorn Seedling Edition. This is just for the core rules. There will be additional videos in the future as more modules and optional rules are released for the game to show you how those rules work and how they can be sewn into the rules that you're going to see today. So, this is, like I said, Thorn Seedling Edition. There's some incredible art that Galen Peugeot has done for it. Galen does great art, and he's going to be continuing to do art for Thorn and a bunch of other projects. This is going to be a very minimalistic looking document. It's only really like 5 pages of content and then, title pages, back page, and all stuff like that. So I want you to keep in mind before we dive into this that this is a really streamlined experience. The goal of this, as the name implies, is that this is a seedling. This is something that is going to grow. It's going to have a lot of gaps in it. It's going to have a lot of room for you to interpret how the rules are going to work, and that is very intentional. I want you to see that this is a game that has a lot of growth potential in it, and that will come in the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but just sort of to set the stage here. It is a Lumen game, so it's illuminated by Lumen 2.0. To kind of just speak broadly about the design philosophies behind this game, this is the fantasy game that's been inside my head for a very long time. I have had the idea of making a fantasy game like many designers. We all have that fantasy heartbreaker. I've tried a few different iterations, and what I've done essentially is I've stripped away a lot of the stuff that I've done before and boiled it down to what I think is essential to a fantasy game, where I'm at right now in terms of what I think is essential for a fantasy game. So to set the stage here, this is a game that is going to be diceless. So there's not going to be any dice involved in it. That's part of the Lumen 2.0 philosophy. There's not going to be any health for enemies. So we're not tracking hit points or health or anything like that for enemies. And really, we're not doing that for the player so much, but you'll see what that looks like. Combat is supposed to be very fast and much more like a puzzle rather than sort of power fantasy wiping out waves of enemies that we've seen in other Lumen games. And ultimately, my goal is to make this game just as much about exploration of a world than it is fighting. Um, there's going to be elements of those principles that I've just outlined here in the seedling rules, and then those principles will be sort of highlighted and grown upon as more modules are released for the game. I'm just sort of setting the stage here for what's going to be, again, a relatively streamlined and light experience here. And I do want to say one last thing before I kind of dive into the rules themselves is, you know, a lot of people see Diceless and they go, well, how is this a game? What is the game? How do I play this? And that's because you come from a place where you are very much used to letting dice be the dictators of how role playing works. And I just want to kind of encourage you, if you've never tried a diceless game, to be open minded to what this experience might afford you. All right, let's dive into how Thorn actually works. From a rule standpoint, it's pretty dang light. You're going to be playing as these characters called Thorns. You take place in a world called Oberon, which, if you've seen some of my other games, that's a name that comes up a lot. Right now, the place of Oberon is just overflowing with magic, and you are essentially these adventurers. As you saw the character on the front, you're sort of these like ranger-like characters who are going out into Oberon and just experiencing this magic rush and overgrowth of the world. What does a character have? Well, if you've played a Lumen game, these are going to look pretty familiar. You're going to have 3 approaches. I've got my placeholders in here of force, flow, and focus. Approaches basically say how you act in the world. So this is not a game that has skill lists. You're not told exactly which skills of persuasion, animal companionship, perception that you have. Instead, we assume Thorns are very good at what they do. They're adventurers. So what's more important is how they do things. And so how you do things are either with force, so those are powerful, evocative sort of actions, maybe things of great strength or power. Things you act with flow. Those are those sort of quick, reactive, effective sort of approaches. And then things with focus are those slow, methodical, precise actions. And you can imagine that those can be used in all sorts of different scenarios. So obviously, if I'm out in the wilderness, I could use force to like push over a giant barrier or a blast through a rock that's in my way. But I could also use force to like emotionally compel an NPC to do something for me. A great act of like demand from them, as opposed to focus, which might be something that's a little bit slower, more practiced or methodical. That again could be acting out in the world, setting up a very specific type of trap or something like that. But it could also be a detailed and sort of data driven way of describing why somebody should help you out, trying to persuade somebody through logic rather than emotion. So hopefully you can see that these approaches are used in all sorts of scenarios, and it's about how you're doing things rather than what you're doing things. The other thing about these approaches is that they act as your life force, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Your characters have load, which is how much stuff they can carry. Basically, everything that you carry takes up 1 point of load. So if you have 3 points of load, you can carry 3 things. What are those things? Equipment. That's going to be weapons, tools, and relics. We'll talk about those in just a second. Your character also has two other kind of like abilities that you have. There are tactics. These are powers, essentially. These are things that you use in combat to more effectively fight enemies, and talents. These are things that are not necessarily used for combat, but are usually more so for exploration sides of the game, social sides of the game. These are more narrative boons that are representations of skills that you have learned as a Thorn over time. When you play the game, you start with one in every approach, and then you have some points to spend to increase those as you see fit. You also have a load value that starts at 3, which you can increase or decrease by changing your approaches. So if you feel like you're going to want to carry a lot of stuff, you might take a hit on your approaches. If you want to pack light, you can do that and actually gain some benefits to your approaches. You're going to choose some equipment, which I'll show you in just a second, and you also get to choose one tactic and talent to start the game. That's making your Thorn. Now, how does the game actually work? Well, it's like most role playing games, a conversation between players and GM. GM sets up scenarios, obstacles, challenges, and the Thorns are going to respond to those by describing what their characters are doing. Outside of combat, if a Thorn is trying to do something and there's some form of risk, this is normally in a lot of role playing games where you would roll the dice. Again, this is a diceless game though, so what do you do instead? Well, the conversation happens, you describe what it is that you're trying to do, and when we think about how you're trying to do it, there's an obvious approach that is being called for. The GM kind of confirms with the player, it sounds like you're doing something kind of forceful right now. And if that's what we feel like the situation is, that player marks a point of their approach, the whatever approach it is they're using. So let's say a character has 3 force and they've just started their expedition, so they're full, fresh, they're refreshed, they haven't spent anything. The first time that they spend force, they take a point away. So now they have 2 out of 3 force left. That's telling us that these characters are going to diminish over time, that throughout the case of the adventure, they're going to get weaker, slower, their minds are going to get a little fogged up and not able to make decisions as quickly. This is to show the degradation of a character as they go through an adventure. So now these resources, which again are also your health and your life force, are going away to demonstrate that our characters will get tired in the many ways that we can get tired. If a character does something and they either don't have the approach or they want to try doing something with an approach that maybe isn't in line with how the GM is sort of imagining it going through, they have 2 options. One, they can spend a different approach. If they do, the approach gets marked just like everything else, but a complication gets added to the scene. Something like the typical complications that we see in other games, like it takes longer or it's less effective. If a Thorn wants to do something and they have 0 points, or they just simply don't want to spend an approach, they can do the action. It succeeds, but there's a peril added. These are much worse complications. In the Seedling version, it's up to the GM to sort of interpret how bad of a reaction the world is going to take place. You'll see in future rules modules where there will be sort of more explicit guidance on what a peril actually looks like and how that will largely be dependent on where in the world the Thorns are at the time. But it could be something like being ambushed, equipment being lost or broken, some form of harm or something like that. That's how characters do everything outside of combat. It's just a matter of conversation and spending these points. So it's a resource management game when you get down to it. Now, the equipment that the Thorns have access to are in three categories: weapons, relics, and tools. Like I said before, they can carry whatever they want up to their load limit. So if a Thorn starts with 3 load and they didn't change it during character creation, they can carry 3 things from this list. Weapons are weapons. Notice here's the thing about the weapons right away is that they list a range that they can be used at, far or close, and then there's just a little bit of flavor text. There's no list of damage that they deal or a type of damage or anything like that. That's intentional. We'll cover why when we get to combat, but they're meant to be very straightforward. Relics are magic items. As the world of Open is getting flooded with magic, relics of the old past are basically getting reignited. And so these are going to be powers, essentially magic spells or abilities that the Thorns can call on through arcane devices that they have access to, that they kind of carry around with them. Some of these have explicit reactions, like pushing everybody that's close to you to far. So just boom, pushing everybody away with sort of like a wave of force. Others are more passive, like Third Eye. This hidden secrets reveal themselves to you. As long as you have this, that is going to happen. Or the Whisper Cloak. As long as you carry a Whisper Cloak, you don't make any noise while walking. So you can see that relics can either be sort of an active thing that you're using or a passive benefit that is being afforded to your character. Lastly, there are tools. Tools are going to be things that maybe aren't as like shiny as the relics. They're not as exciting as the magic effects, but they're really essential to exploration and travel, right? Being able to have a shelter of some kind or simply have rope, right? Every adventurer needs their standard set of rope. What does the role of tools play in the game? Well, let's think back to those approaches and how things are done outside of combat. Sometimes a tool is necessary before a Thorn can even approach doing something in the first place. It's going to be really hard to climb a wall if you have no gear that lets you climb it, at the very least, a rope of some kind. So sometimes the tools just simply unlock the ability for the Thorns to do something in the first place. The other thing is that these tools can also be used to say that the Thorn doesn't need to spend an approach. Maybe they would if they didn't have the right tools on them, but they have them. And so now they can save that precious resource that they're spending because they brought the right tool for whatever it is that they might have run into while out in the wilderness. Here's another picture of a Thorn here. You can kind of see that we're leaning into a theme here. There's sort of this bark, wooden-based mask going on here. The thorny, kind of prickly shoulder pad that's going on. We'll get more into that in future videos in terms of what these thorns actually are and why they are the way they are, but I just like to point that out as we're moving through. Tactics and talents, like I said, these are going to be powers for combat and narrative skills that you can do outside of combat. In the Seedling Edition, which is what we're talking about now, these are just listed as sort of a la carte lists that people can just choose during character creation and say, this is what I want, this is not what I want. In future versions of the game, these will be pushed aside or kind of slotted into more specific roles, like what we might see as classes in other games, and magic schools, which will come from those masks that the Thorns are wearing. For now, in this really simple version, there's just a list of 10 tactics and 10 talents that the players can choose from. Expect in the future for those to be much more themed towards certain things and broken into clusters and categories where you can kind of say, I want the more support tactics, or I want the more necromancer talents and things like that. Talents are these powers that you can use only in combat, and the way that they work is they can only be used once per fight. So it's a one and done sort of thing, again, leaning into that resource management side of the game where you decide, this is when I want to use this power. I need it right now. What are these sorts of powers? Simply things like not taking harm, or allowing thorns near you to heal, or something like this. Practice. You deal harm to a number of enemies equal to your focus. So you look at the weapon that you have. Maybe I have a sword. It lets me hit people up close. I deal harm to a number of enemies equal to my focus. Let's say that I made a really focused character. They have 4 focus. When I decide to spend this power, I'm taking out 4 enemies, essentially. I'm dealing harm to 4 enemies. It's a big swing, but I can only do it once per fight. So I got to decide when the right time is for that. Talents then are going to be things that are going to be more narrative. They're going to be more used for exploration, social interaction, things like that. As you can see, like Beloved, NPCs treat you kindly. When you show up in towns, you're going to be, taken care of. Or they can be weird, like Celestial. When you meditate under the stars, you're going to get a glimpse of what might happen tomorrow. I like Connected a lot. You have a spy network. First time you show up in a city, someone's going to report to you what they've been hearing in that area. These, again, they are very loose in their narrative interpretation and mechanical access. They aren't the same thing as once per fight you can do this or spending a use of it. They are meant to represent these talents and skills that the thorns will develop over time. Like I said, both of these are just listed as sort of generic a la carte lists for now. Expect future versions of this game to have much more thematic lists depending on the role that you're playing and the mask that your thorn is wearing. How does a fight work then? Is it the same thing as the spending the approaches? Not really. It can be like that, but it's pretty straightforward. I want you to think about fighting in this game as very quick and very puzzle-like. Why is it puzzle-like? Why is it quick? Well, let's talk about the two factions that are fighting each other. There's the Thorns and there's the enemies. When the Thorns act, they get to act in whatever order that they want. They kind of can popcorn the order around. After each Thorn, an enemy is going to get activated, and we kind of just go back and forth, back and forth. During their turn, what can a Thorn do? Any two things they want. They can move, they can use any of that equipment that we talked about, so that's weapons, relics, things like that. They could spend one of those tactics that they have, those once per fight things, or they could just simply spend an approach if they feel like they want to do something in the field that doesn't kind of line up with a weapon or equipment or anything that they've done so far. In terms of range, it's really simple. Everything is either close to you or far from you. It's theater of the mind. We're not going to use a grid here, so it's all about relative positioning. You might be close to one thing but far from another, and an ally of yours might be close to the thing that you are far from. It's all about where you are relative to locations and characters rather than specific distances. When the fighting takes place, these characters are going to be dealing harm to one another. What does that harm look like in a game that doesn't have dice and doesn't have health necessarily? Let's talk about what happens when a thorn takes damage. When thorns take damage, they lose a point of the maximum value of one of their approaches. So let's go back to that character I said earlier that had a lot of force value of 4, or focus. When they take a point of damage, maybe that character, that enemy, is meant to sort of trip up the mind or slow us down in that regard. I lose a maximum value of my focus down to 3 now. That might affect the number of uses I have left if I haven't spent anything of that. And if I have spent any, I'm not losing any uses. Let me give you an example. Let's say my character has 3 force as their maximum, but I've spent a bunch of it in the fight, or across the mission so far. I only have 1 point of force left. If I get hit and my maximum value of force goes down to 2, I still have that 1 use. That doesn't go away. So what's going on when we lose maximum value is that it's not discouraging the thorns from spending their approaches throughout the fight or throughout the adventure leading up to that, because the uses, the points themselves, aren't your health. It's the maximum values that are. These things will recover at the start of every adventure, and there will be tactics and talents and a whole bunch of things in future versions that let you recover this stuff. But that's how it works. If a thorn ever reaches 0 for their maximum value for all 3 approaches, they're dying, or they have died. I'll let your table decide whether or not thorns die fully, or if they just kind of respawn back at the camp to take care of themselves. Thorns are going to use their weapons, relics, tactics, all that sort of stuff to attack enemies. Here's the thing about enemies. They don't have approaches like the thorns do. They don't have health. Pretty much every enemy in the game is going to, by default, die from one source of harm. That's why the weapons don't have an amount of harm or damage that they deal, and why some of these things just say deal harm. I'm just dealing harm, and if an enemy takes harm, they die. They're done. It's over for them. This is leaning into that idea of combat being very quick. Now you might be going, well, hold on a second. What about like bosses or more elite enemies or a dragon? Am I going to kill a dragon with just one swing of my axe? Not necessarily. Some enemies are going to be more robust, but what they have is defenses rather than hit points that you have to get through. Here's some examples of some defenses. These are sort of like narrative, semi mechanical things that you need to, as Thorns, figure out about the enemy in order to override them. So, for example, an enemy might be armored, it requires some sort of very powerful blow or weakening the armor. And once that defense is taken care of, the enemy dies in one hit. This is the puzzle side of combat. So enemies are going to either die in one hit because they're just little goblins and you're taking them out, or they're a little puzzle box. They've got these tags, and these are just some example tags right here. I encourage GMs to make up their own. These tags the players have to figure out and then figure out how they're going to overcome those things. How can they creatively spend uses or approaches that they have? How can they use the tools that they brought or the tactics that they have? How can they use their weapons in interesting ways to overcome these specific defenses? Once all the defenses of an enemy has been taken care of, they die in one piece of harm. So one point of harm, one source of harm, and they die as long as you've taken care of those defenses. To use another sort of analogy, I want you to think about like an MMORPG boss, or to use a video game that I love, Destiny. A lot of these bosses, they have sort of a damage phase where you're not really effectively hurting them until you do a bunch of little mini objectives. You have to weaken them or do stuff in the environment that sets the group up to say, now the boss is vulnerable. Let's take it out. I want you to think about a lot of enemies in Thorn as that. They are little mini bosses that you need to figure out, okay, they got this weird arcane shield that keeps coming up. How are we going to get past this arcane shield? Or, oh, this ooze keeps regenerating every time that we kill it. How are we going to make sure this thing stays dead when we actually take it out? That's the puzzle. That's the creativity. That's what I want to see in combat. I don't want to see how long is it going to take us to take out 100 hit points of a boss or an enemy of some kind. I want to see how can we creatively come together to overcome these enemies. Like I said, this is a very short example list of some of the defenses you might see. I want GMs to create their own. There's going to be more in future modules and things like that, but that's for you sort of to be inspired by how I see combat working in this game. In terms of rules, that's pretty much everything. The Thorns are going to go out on adventures. When they do so, they choose the stuff that they're going to bring with them. They max out their approaches, and then they go on an adventure. In terms of advancement in the Seedling edition of the game, it's really simple. Every time you finish an adventure, choose one of four things. Increase the max of one of your approaches +1, increase your load +1 so you can carry more stuff, learn one of those tactics that you haven't learned before, or learn a talent. Advancement's going to change kind of significantly as we move out of this Seedling Edition into the more specific modules and the full version of the game. This is just simply something that you can use for now. Also, think about equipment, right? What are some new relics, fun magic items that you can give your characters, or new weapons that they might use? Again, you'll see more of that stuff in future versions of the game, which leads me to sort of my last point here as we wrap this up. This is a modular game. It's a growing game right now. This is a very minimalistic framework, obviously, that you can work with. Expect there to be lots of modules that are going to expand these rules, but because it's modular right now, these rules are optional. You can play everything you need with just the things that we went over today. But there's going to be rules for exploration, putting together point crawl maps to move around. There's going to have a camp component that you're managing. There's going to be those classes and those masks that I talked about that will give you sort of like a role to fill and more thematic packages of talents and tactics. We'll think about combat in a little bit more precise way with like maybe a turn order that makes more sense, or giving you just simply more examples of enemies and defenses and things like that that the GM can play with. There's going to be a lot more to this game, and I want you to kind of glue together a version of it that best fits you. Speaking of gluing it all together, the last thing I'll say is this. Like I said, this is a seedling that is going to grow. My goal is eventually, over across all these videos and these different modules, is eventually to sew this together into my ideal fantasy RPG. I'm going to have a lot of fun releasing it in this modular format. It's going to let me play with things and see what systems work, what systems don't, what agrees with me, what doesn't, what do people like and what do people not like. That eventually I'll create sort of the big final version of Thorn. But for now, we had some fun talking about the Seedling Edition. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what this is. If this is interesting to you, there are links down below or above or all over the place where you can find the Seedling Edition core rules. and there will be future videos where I dive into the other modules. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.